Today we are on chapter 21 of the book, The Places That Scare You. And this chapter is titled Spiritual Friend. And she starts out with a quote by Chogyam Trungpa, which is, "The real function of a spiritual friend is to insult you." I had heard it a little bit different than that, which is that their function is to push you to go further than you would on your own. But Trungpa Rinpoche, he was a little bit, what would I say, more in your face at times. And so that's, I'm sure, where that quote comes from. So whatever, we need a master warrior, a teacher, a spiritual friend, a lama, a guide, lots of different names, to help us progress along the path. And the prerequisite for making a deeper commitment to a spiritual friend is to develop this maitri for ourselves, this warm spot in our heart, to really develop deep caring about ourselves. And then we also need confidence in the teacher. We need to feel the teacher is trustworthy. This relationship is an unconventional relationship, and it is going towards being an unconditional relationship. So we have to be careful. And she described Chogyam Trungpa this way, as a person who was not caught up in their ego, who was never swept away by emotional upheavals and the uncertainty of what's going on around him. She said, I couldn't manipulate him. And he obviously knew how to cut through people's trips. On page 114, she says this, quote, moving closer to someone who is so dangerous to the ego takes time. So that also shows that what we are doing is we are weakening our ego as we make a commitment to this path and to a warrior teacher or a bodhisattva teacher. And it is dangerous to the ego, and as a result of that, it is uncomfortable to our ego. Which goes right back to the original quote, which is the real function of a spiritual friend is to insult you. And what is really being insulted is your ego, your assumptions, the ground that we stand on that we think is so solid, but in fact is not. This relationship with a teacher, it encourages us to trust our basic wisdom. instead of our ego, our assumptions, our beliefs, our kleshas, and so forth. And so what happens is, as the relationship progresses, we start letting go. We start not grasping onto things so hard, especially grasping onto our own neurosis, our afflictive states of mind. We start trusting our basic intelligence instead of, you might say, our neurosis, our ego. We start to develop our own, to trust our own inherent kindness. So not only do we open up to our teacher, but we open up to our own experience, and we open up to ourselves. In a way, we start getting to know ourselves much better than we ever had before. We start seeing in great detail all the dark corners in our lives. You might say our closets, the places that we didn't look before, that we were afraid to look before, that we denied, and so forth. And as she says, we begin to accept all the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the neutral. My experience with a good teacher is that they know more about you than you know about you. And part of what they do is lead you on a journey of discovering all of this about you. Everything from your qualities and potentials, your Buddha nature, to your neurosis, your faults, the things that you need to let go of, the things that you keep doing that harm yourself and harm other people. And again, that's why it can feel dangerous and uncomfortable. On page 115, she has another quote that I like. Bodhisattva training encourages us to have a passionate involvement with life, regarding no emotion or action as unworthy of our love and compassion, regarding no person or situation as unacceptable. So it's the teacher's duty to show us when we are off track. Again, one thing that I experienced with Khenpo Karta Rinpoche is I would have an interview with him, and among other things, I would talk about certain problems, sometimes problems I'm having with other members of the Sangha, and so forth. And almost always his response to these things would be, that's minor. So the teacher is someone that can kind of help us get some perspective. The teacher is someone who will listen to you. And again, I found with my relationship with Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche that he listened and he listened and he listened, and he actually usually said very little in response. But what he did say was always meaningful and right to the point. So the teacher is also then someone that we can learn from and are willing to learn from. And as we progress and travel the path, eventually what happens is that the situation that we are in becomes the teacher. That by paying attention to what's happening right now in the room that you are in and the people that are there, that is what is teaching you. Every situation is unique. Every situation is new. And so when you can tune into that rather than your habitual patterns and judgments and so forth, then you start seeing things freshly and more clearly. So getting back to the teacher, with the teacher, because he can't be conned, you can't present a self, or present yourself as somebody that you would like him to see rather than who you actually are, because the teacher will see you, at least a good teacher will see you as you are, with all the warts and the faults as well as the qualities and the potential. And that state of uncertainty can be uncomfortable, and she says it's a bit of a paradox. Again, what I have found when I am with these great enlightened masters is I really felt naked, that they could see everything. And needless to say, that is an uncomfortable feeling, but that I kept coming back because that's important. You really want a good teacher to guide you. And if the teacher doesn't really know who you are, they can't guide you. Now, a teacher will usually not tell you the truth. The teacher will lead you so that you can discover the truth. A very good example of this is sitting meditation. By practicing sitting meditation on a regular basis, gradually you start learning things about yourself and about the technique. And as you learn this, it becomes your truth. It's not just something that you are repeating that you heard from somewhere else or that you read somewhere. So the teacher is not neurotic, but we still are, and it is the teacher's duty to help us to see our neurosis when they arise and then to work with it. So she goes on to talk about, because of this being, you might say, naked, when you're with the teacher, there is this tension. When you're in the teacher's presence, and again, I know Trungpa Rinpoche, he was, let's just say it was more uncomfortable being in his presence than it can be in the presence of a lot of other great masters. But that was just the way he presented himself. I remember when I first got involved with Tibetan Buddhism, that I was listening to cassette tapes of talks that Trungpa Rinpoche had given. And on this one, there was a question and answer session. And a student spoke up and said something like, "What is the role of the teacher?" And as soon as that question was out of his mouth, there was a huge clap of thunder. And the room kind of echoed with a very nervous laughter that went through the room. And this was Chogyam Trungpa that they were asking this question of. And I'm sure some of them felt that he had purposely caused that thunder. I really can't remember what the answer to the question was, but that really stuck out at me at how this nervous laughter arose after that clap of thunder. So she talks about some of the problems that can happen with the student-teacher relationship. She uses the phrase closing down, developing bad views about the teacher. So she says we have to inhabit the space between the teacher being a charlatan that is just totally in this for his own or her own selfish reasons, and the teacher being completely perfect. They're just really hard to find a totally perfect teacher these days. On the other hand, we also do need common sense, and we need to examine the teacher, especially before you become a student of the teacher in Vajrayana. And she says, too, that at some point it may be that, in her words, the bottom falls out of our dreams. And that is that the teacher does something, or that your relationship with the teacher changes to the point where you have to leave the teacher. And she says, can you stay with that pain and disappointment without justifying it or condemning the teacher? And she says, if we can, the teacher has taught us well. So even if we leave a teacher, we need to have avoid condemning and so forth. So finally, here she talks about a man named Joel, who, this was when Chogyam Trungpa was alive, and he died in 1987. So this happened a long time ago. And Joel was a student of Rinpoche, and he had emotional difficulties. and was getting more and more agitated over the days and weeks. And finally, he actually slapped a woman. And Trungpa Rinpoche, at that point, exhibited what we call wrathful behavior. And he told Joel, I never want to see your face again. So Joel left, and then the other students started thanking Trungpa for sending him away and speaking to him that way. And they condemned Joel for being bad and so forth. And then Trungpa Rinpoche said, quote, I think you do not understand. Joe and I are the best of friends. So what Trungpa Rinpoche did was he exhibited this wrathful behavior to stop Joe's behavior and to wake him up, not to punish him or banish him. This wrathful behavior just brings your mind directly to what is important and you need to look at. She doesn't talk about what happened after that, in the months and years after that. But I have seen other lamas exhibit this kind of behavior too. And it's not out of attachment or aversion, but it is a technique that is used to wake a person up when they need to be brought to their senses. So she finishes up this chapter with a quote that I like on page 117. The teachers love the student. The teacher's love for the student manifests as compassion. The student's love for the teacher is devotion. So that is the final point of that chapter. Now, the last chapter is called the in-between state. And she describes it as between solidifying with ideas and ideology and beliefs and resting with nothing to hold on to, a state of groundlessness. So this, you might say, is a paradox, that on one hand, we want comfort in our physical world. We want food that we like. We like to drink things that we like to drink. In our house, we like our car, and so forth. We're attached to all of these things. But we need to realize that there is really no security in any of these physical things. She says this is where we grow up, in this in-between place. It's realizing that we can't, you might say, go home, that we can't go back to where we were before we began the spiritual journey. We know too much. Yet there still is this yearning for security, for refuge or comfort. That this is a place of anxiety, heartbreak, and tenderness. They're not contradictory. Quote, by not knowing, not hoping to know, I'm not acting like we know what's happening, and not acting like we know what's happening. We begin to access our inner strength. This is on page 120. This is groundlessness. So instead of becoming more rigid, complaining more, and struggling, we let all these difficulties and uncertainties soften us up. She says that this open-ended, tender, in-between place is called bodhicitta, this mind of awakening. That this state is what heals, this in-between state. It allows us to let go of self-importance. It helps us develop courage and bravery. So meditation allows us to experience this. When we meditate, anything and everything can come up. And it does. But whatever comes up, we acknowledge it and let it go. We don't hang on to it if we are meditating properly. When our mind becomes agitated and we want to get up, if we are meditating properly, we stay with that mind on the cushion and let it pass. If anger arises when we're on the cushion, we stay and let it pass. We just keep practicing, going forward, and remaining open to whatever comes. She says that as we go through life, now I'm not talking about practicing on the cushion, just going through our lives, that we run into paradoxes, especially ourselves, that sometimes we can be very kind and loving, sometimes we can be, in her words, uptight and angry, perhaps even cruel. She has said this over and over again throughout the book in different ways. Here she says we allow ourselves to be human rather than condemn ourselves for being imperfect. That if we can forgive ourselves and then stay in touch with our tender heart, this is training in bodhicitta. It's recognizing where we have done things that we regret and that were harmful to ourselves or others. But instead of condemning ourselves, being kind and caring and trying to guide yourself to better behavior in the future. She also talks about us being at the crossroads, where there are different directions we can go in. But for an advanced practitioner of bodhicitta and warrior training, that right can be as extreme a view as wrong, that both block our innate wisdom. That if we can maintain that open-ended viewpoint, we can meet the unknown without fear. And she compares this to the bardo. The bardo literally means gap. The in-between state or intermediate state, that state between the end of one thing and the beginning of another. And in Tibetan Buddhism, there are different bardos. One is the bardo between birth and death. But if you might say, zoom in to a closer look, that as we just go through our daily life, we are constantly in this in-between state, between one that has ended and another one that hasn't yet begun. And we're in the middle of whatever's going on right now. And a lot of times, as she said, we really don't have that good of an idea of what's going on. And we just plug into our habitual patterns, our habitual way of thinking, our habitual judgments, and so forth. So if we have compassion and loving kindness and courage, this will allow us to be genuine in this intermediate state or this in-between state. And again, it's a state of realizing that you are constantly in transition. What is happening right now is in transition. The future is open and unpredictable. And again, this is where courage and bravery comes in. Being able to accept this kind of an approach and not panic, not be overcome with it. She uses the word paradox again. And she quotes Suzuki Roshi. This is one of his more famous quotes. Quote, "The secret of Zen is just two words, not always so," unquote. And of course, that's three words. So you've got a paradox, and that things are not always so. They are not what we think they are. They're not going in the direction that we think they are. And she finishes up that last chapter. This is the last sentence. This is on page 122. Quote, "Resting here completely, steadfastly experiencing the clarity of the present moment is called enlightenment." So this is where we are going. It's a difficult place to, you might say, relax in, dwell in. In fact, it's not even a place. But the idea is that we can be in between this and that, and rest in that uncertainty, rest in that groundlessness, and not only survive, but thrive. Because enlightened masters are able to do that. A quote that came to my mind as I was reading this last chapter, and especially that last sentence about this is called enlightenment. Sometimes Chogyam Trungpa would be asked by his students, what is it like when you're enlightened? And also, how can you navigate the world when, and this crazy world that we live in, Western society, if you have it, in this in-between state? And Trungpa Rinpoche answered something to the effect of, we don't have enlightenment wards for people that are enlightened because they can't handle it. That when you are enlightened or approaching it, you are much more able to work with whatever is happening right now in front of you. It's this situation of letting what's happening right now be your teacher and guide. So I want to read the aspiration that she has after this last chapter. And it's a beautiful aspiration. Throughout my life until this very moment, whatever virtue I have accomplished, including any benefit that may come from this book, I dedicate to the welfare of all beings. May the roots of suffering diminish. May warfare, violence, neglect, indifference, and addictions also decrease. May the wisdom and compassion of all beings increase now and in the future. May we clearly see all the barriers we erect between ourselves and others to be as insubstantial as our dreams. May we appreciate the great perfection of all phenomena. May we continue to open our hearts and minds in order to work ceaselessly for the benefit of all beings. May we go to the places that scare us. May we lead the life of a warrior. And then after that, she has the 7 points of mind training slogan.